For all those who sacrificed their lives for the Irish Republic, and to those yet living who will never abandon it. Prologue. I moved to the bow of the Valhalla and inhaled a deep breath of sea air. The weather was mild with no rain and good visibility. Shore lights shimmered on the dark water, and there was a gentle swell, but it wasn't bad. I had been on boats a lot during my time in the Marine Corps, but never on a shrimping trawler, trying to smuggle 7 tons of weapons and ammunition across the wide Atlantic in hurricane season. An initial taste of what might lie ahead occurred when we left the harbour mouth and ploughed into the first of the wild Atlantic swells. They were moderate, but the boat shuddered like a car going too fast over a speed bump. I braced myself and stood for a while longer at the bow. The lights from the American East Coast receded behind us as the ocean before us grew blacker. In 14 days or so, if everything went to plan, we would land the weapons and ammunition in Ireland. I had left Ireland some months earlier with £9,000 and instructions to build an arms network from scratch. I was returning with $250,000 worth of equipment and a boat and crew prepared to take it all the way. I had also acquired contacts and resources that would prove invaluable in the future. The first few days at sea were routine and uneventful, but then we lost our autopilot. With the autopilot functioning, the steering wheel in the pilot house could be set to a specific heading and maintain it despite strong winds and currents, but with it out of action, someone had to be at the wheel at all times to keep us on course. It was mainly Bob Anderson, John McIntyre, and myself who took turns in 4-hour shifts. About halfway across the ocean, we had a day when the sea was like glass. I never saw calmer water, not even on a fishing pond. The wake from the Valhalla caused the only ripple in the utter tranquility of the benign Atlantic. I had no idea I was experiencing the proverbial calm before the storm. That night, the winds began to build and the sea churned. Bob grew concerned. He told me that a hurricane he'd been monitoring in the Bahamas was coming up the Gulf Stream and heading in our direction. Shortly afterwards, all hell broke loose. The Valhalla wasn't designed for the battering it was about to receive. Enormous waves, 40 to 50 feet high, dwarfed the boat, while ferocious winds, driving rain, and crashing seas swept the deck. The boat reeled violently from side to side, its stabilizing outriggers almost touching the surface with each roll. Walls of cold, dark water made endless attempts to swamp us. Then, an enormous wave landed an almost knockout blow to the boat. There was the sound of a massive crash, and I was thrown forward violently. It felt like a car collision. I stumbled from my berth to a chilling sight. 4 of Valhalla's 7 tempered glass windows had been blown in. Bob was on his knees with blood gushing from a head wound caused by broken glass. He was trying desperately to hold onto the wheel while John rendered him assistance. Water had poured into the pilot house and down into the forward engine room, causing a short circuit and starting a fire. Smoke poured up from the engine room where the guns and ammunition were stored. Seawater sloshed around my ankles. I knew at that moment we were doomed. Blood was everywhere, but to my immense relief, Bob was lucid and able to function. John did his best to clean and dress Bob's wounds while I took the wheel, trying to steer us into the waves so we didn't get broadsided. There was so much damage to the boat, and the storm was so fierce and persistent, I could not conceive of us evading catastrophe for much longer. I asked Bob if we should put on the survival suits we had brought along. "There's no point," he gasped painfully. "We're in the middle of the ocean. We have no communications. Nobody knows we're here. Go ahead and put it on if you want to, but it'll take you 8 hours longer to die." None of us put them on. Chapter 6. Whitey. When I arrived in Boston with my torn $5 note, it brought me to an old man called John Connolly, who hailed originally from County Galway. John was a sincere and dedicated Republican, without a criminal bone in his body. But having lived a lifetime in Southie, the local vernacular for South Boston, he knew who some of the major criminals were. There is a saying that needs must when the devil drives. We needed money, guns, and false driving licenses to buy more guns. Law-abiding citizens are a poor source for these items. I first met James Whitey Bulger when I was taken to Triple O's Tavern by a son-in-law of John Connolly. I had another IRA man called Mark with me. I had met Mark through the IRA's support network in America. He had been wounded while on active service in Ireland and was recuperating in the States. It was a fortuitous encounter, as I needed reliable help, and there was no better or more enthusiastic candidate than this brave volunteer from East Tyrone. Mark was tall, blue-eyed, and blond, more Germanic in appearance than Irish. He had what would have been called in another age a bit of a dash about him. He was highly intelligent, with a quirky sense of humour and a remarkable ability to mimic accents which, combined with his good looks, made him popular with the ladies. In his free time, he enjoyed nothing better than the leisurely read of a good book in a neighbourhood coffee shop. He referred to it as cultivating my ennui. More than one waitress bade him a sad farewell, never realizing her partner for the night was not, indeed, a Danish aristocrat. Mark and I were shown a short film on the Irish Troubles in a back room of Triple O's. We were then brought to a dingy upstairs office to meet Jim Bulger. I can't remember when I first heard the name Whitey, but I recall being advised not to call him that to his face. Whitey shook hands with us. He was polite and respectful without being fawning. We reciprocated but gave false names. Whitey projected an air of calm, but unalloyed authority, and was casually but immaculately dressed, sporting a short, expensive-looking brown leather jacket, top-of-the-range designer jeans, and cowboy boots, which were in style at the time. He was freshly shaven and impeccably groomed, with clean, manicured nails. He carried himself well, chest out, shoulders back. In future meetings, I never saw him with a hair out of place. His image meant a lot to him, and he managed it with care. I was 25 years old at the time. Mark was 23. Whitey would have been around 54, but was lean and energetic. You could tell he worked out. We paid our respects and left. Shortly after that, Whitey Bulger and a group of men I later learned were Steve Flemmy, Kevin Weeks, and Pat Nee met Mark and me in the Southie apartment where we were staying with Republican sympathizers. We sat across from each other in the living room, sizing each other up. Everyone was courteous. It occurred to me that my accent might seem unusual, even suspicious, as it was more American than Irish. I hoped it would not cause them to doubt my bona fides as an IRA volunteer, or even suspect I wasn't who I purported to be. It didn't take a genius to determine who was the boss. Whitey did most of the talking on behalf of his team. I didn't know Jim Bulger from a crow, and I knew nothing about his criminal activities or operations, nor did I want to know. I had a vague notion he could help us acquire guns, but little more than that, and I didn't really want to work with criminals. When I told Martin McGuinness that I was extremely uncomfortable with this operation, his succinct reply was, "Little old ladies in Noriad can't get us M60 machine guns?" In calling them criminals, I am not making a moral judgment. They referred to themselves as criminals. They didn't employ euphemisms or tiptoe around the subject. They engaged in organized crime for a living and made no bones about it. They were refreshingly honest on that score. They were bad boys. If I didn't like it, I could fuck off back to Ireland. Otherwise, it was what it was. Whitey spoke knowledgeably about the Troubles. He knew more about the topic than many people in Ireland living south of the border. He read a lot and asked sensible questions. Whitey wasn't emotional about it like some Americans. He struck me as being intelligent and professional. I rapidly deduced that whatever criminal activity this guy was involved in, he wasn't snatching handbags off grannies. To say I didn't trust him and his men was an understatement. It takes time to build a relationship. I also didn't know what they could do for us or how far they were willing to go, but I doubted Whitey would jeopardize his own enterprise for our benefit. Still, any help they could give would be appreciated. After an hour or so of conversation, Whitey handed me a wad containing $5,000 as a donation. I thanked him and placed it on the table in front of me. I took out a notebook and noted it down. I asked Mark to witness it. Pat Nee later told me that Whitey was impressed with this. Pat said that if I had taken the money and put it in my wallet, we would never have gotten another penny. I couldn't help glancing at a sea bag they had brought into the room. It was similar to the ones we used in the Marine Corps. I was curious as to what it contained. After handing over the money, one of Whitey's men opened the bag and emptied it of weapons. There were at least a dozen pistols, including semi-automatics and revolvers. There was also an M1 carbine and a Chinese AK-47 with an underslung, folding stock. Pat Nee said that the AK-47 was brought back from Vietnam by someone who had fought there. He told me he, too, had been in country with the Marines. I was tempted to tell him that I had served in the Corps, but decided to bite my tongue until I knew him better. Mark and I thanked them for the money and weapons. For all we knew, this could be the extent of their support. Nevertheless, we were grateful. It was far more than most gave. I decided to push the boat out and asked them if they knew of any way we could get false driving licenses. We needed them to purchase weapons from gun stores. A New York state license was best because, at that time, it did not include a photograph. However, a good forgery from another East Coast state would suffice. Whitey seemed animated by this and eager to help. He told me he would get someone to steal a driver's license-making machine from the Massachusetts Registry of Motor Vehicles. This guy's motivated, I thought. That particular resource, however, never materialized. Whitey eyeballed us. "You guys look like a couple of micks just off the boat. You gotta blend in around here." He handed Pat Nee a wad of cash and told him to have us looking like Southie boys by the next day. So Pat Nee took me and Mark shopping. We were fitted in classic 1980s gear. Members-only jackets, Calvin Klein jeans, and cowboy boots. We certainly looked the part by the end of that day. Whitey may have given the nod for his men to help us out, but it was Pat Nee who took us under his wing. Pat was the principal driving force behind our Boston operation and looked after us in many ways. While I could never discern Whitey's true motives or intentions, I never doubted that Pat had a genuine love for Ireland and was keen to help the struggle for Irish freedom. Drinking tea in the kitchen of Pat's childhood home in Southie, I could hear his parents in the next room converse in rapid and fluent Irish. Pat was born in Rusmuck, an Irish-speaking district in County Galway. He had emigrated to America at an early age and no longer spoke the native tongue, but his heart remained in the right place. Although he was a patriotic American and cherished his Marine Corps service, Pat never forgot the land of his birth. Pat was proud that his neighborhood of Southie had a reputation for stepping up to the plate. He lived in an apartment on East Broadway, directly across from M Street Park. One day, he took me across to the park to show me the memorial to the 25 Southie boys who died in the Vietnam War. 15 of them were Marines. Southie was your quintessential working-class Irish neighborhood. When America called, you didn't debate the wrongs and rights. You stood tall and took your place in the line. When Ireland called, we got a lot of help there too. During my visit to the States, I made numerous trips to New York on Amtrak. The journey took a little over 4 hours. My primary contact in New York was Liam Ryan from the Moortown Ardbow area of East Tyrone. I usually stayed in his apartment in the Bronx. Liam would have been about 30 years of age at the time and was working for the electric power company Con Edison. He was funny, down to earth, and accommodating. He was proud to be an Irishman and prouder still to be an East Tyrone man. He had tremendous respect and admiration for the volunteers of the IRA and a special place in his heart for the courageous fight put up by the men and women of his home area. He was particularly proud of his cousin Pete Ryan, who, along with 7 other IRA men, shot his way out of Crumlin Road Prison in Belfast in June 1981. Pete was a highly motivated volunteer with extensive operational experience. He would be killed in action in June 1991. Around this time, I also hooked up with Lawrence McNally, another Moortown man. I had last seen him in County Monaghan in the company of Jim Lina. Lawrence was in New York with his partner, trying to put together a little money to return to Ireland and buy a home. He was living in the same apartment complex as Liam Ryan, and had a job tarring roofs in the stifling New York summer heat. He had also taken up jogging, and I went for a few runs with him around Van Cortlandt Park. He looked fit and well, having lost over 2 stone in weight since the last time we met. Lawrence had taken part in numerous IRA operations and cheerfully offered his full support in any endeavor we undertook to supply the Republican movement with weapons. He would later be killed in the same action that took the life of Pete Ryan. Liam, too, was destined to die in the struggle. He was killed in County Tyrone in November 1989 by a loyalist death squad armed, trained, and directed by British military intelligence and the RUC's special branch. As Liam, Lawrence, and I sat planning arms purchases over cups of coffee in a small corner restaurant in the Bronx, these impending tragedies remained mercifully unimagined by us. Liam had contacts all over New York and Philadelphia who bought and stored guns for the IRA. Philadelphia had a large contingent of Tyrone men living and working there, and Liam was eager to help in any way he could. He proudly showed me the comms he had received from his cousin Pete while he was incarcerated in Crumlin Road. Comms were tiny messages written on fragile cigarette paper and wrapped in cellophane. They were smuggled out of prison, and these ones had made their way to Liam in New York. The comms spoke of a planned escape and the urgent need to acquire tiny pistols that could be secretly carried into the prison. Liam duly obtained a few small automatics, .25 caliber if I recall correctly, and sent them to Ireland where they made their way into the Crum to allow the escape to proceed. I made it clear to Liam that I wanted to ensure that we followed a coherent plan in procuring arms. As I had pointed out to Martin McGuinness, it was as easy to do this the right way as the wrong way. Few of our sympathizers purchasing weapons in gun shops had military training or experience. They could end up buying almost anything, and often did. There was little or no direction from the IRA leadership and no discernible strategy that I could see. I was determined to put that right. Buying weapons in retail gun stores is a tedious process. No more than one rifle at a time should be purchased to avoid suspicion. It involves a lot of travel between stores. The rogue arms dealer, who can supply any amount and type of weaponry to the highest bidder, is a myth reserved for thrillers. No substantial arms dealer could operate without government sanction. That sanction might be secret or clandestine for deniability purposes, but it would be there. Otherwise, the dealer wouldn't last a day without being arrested or assassinated by some intelligence agency for eventually supplying the wrong people. I lost track of the number of times someone in the States told me they knew a fellow who could get us anything. I was well aware that the only people who could get us anything were the FBI. If someone claimed they could supply arms, I wanted to know how they got them and why they were willing to sell to us. You cannot buy a man-portable surface-to-air missile from some guy on a bar stool. While in New York, I was told that an Irishman had a contact who claimed to have a large number of M16 assault rifles for sale, brand new in the boxes. The inventory numbered around 900 weapons. I was immediately suspicious, so I sent a communication asking how the rifles had been acquired. A week later, a message returned with a cover story that seemed tantalizingly plausible. Apparently, the weapons were stolen from a railway car that had been part of a freight train held up in or near an Indian reservation in upstate New York. A small gang of Native Americans occasionally robbed a stalled freight car if they could break into it. The weapons were being transported from the Colt factory in Hartford, Connecticut. Military rifles, I was told, were often shipped under the radar as nondescript freight in trucks and trains because it was more secure to transport them this way than in openly marked containers that advertised their contents. The robbery was strictly opportunistic. The thieves hadn't known the shipment contained rifles. There was severe heat from the feds, and they were keen to get rid of them at a reasonable price. It seemed too good to be true. I returned to Boston and asked Pat Nee to organize a meeting with Whitey Bulger. I understood that Whitey had excellent police contacts at local, state, and federal levels. I told Whitey the story and asked whether he could use those contacts to verify if such a theft of M16s had taken place. He got back to me 3 days later and informed me that the scenario was a complete fabrication. The robbery never happened. I was being set up. It wouldn't be my last close shave. Despite the assumption of many Republicans in Ireland, the Troubles made little impact on the general public in America. When they were covered on the news, it irritated me to hear the mantra in the American press about the religious war in Northern Ireland between Catholics and Protestants. They often referred to the Catholic IRA. It was a sectarian line the Brits spun to make the conflict appear irrational in foreign eyes. It gained great traction in America because Britain was their principal ally and rarely challenged on anything. However, the situation was not that simple. The Irish Republican movement had been founded by Protestants 200 years previously. These patriots did not accept that being Protestant meant they were British. Wolfe Tone and Thomas Russell didn't accept it, nor did Henry Joy McCracken. Robert Emmet, the Protestant who led the 1803 rebellion, didn't accept it either. And neither did the Protestants who founded the Young Irelanders, the Protestants who helped establish the Irish Republican Brotherhood, nor Thomas Davis, the Protestant who wrote A Nation Once Again. I found the level of ignorance on the conflict in the States demoralizing. An American woman once asked a friend of mine, "Hey, who won the Black and Tan War anyway? The blacks or the tans?" There remains a widespread misconception that the struggle for Irish freedom is simply about reuniting Ireland. When I joined the IRA, the border had existed for less than 60 years. Historically, the struggle for freedom was about achieving independent nationhood. For the prior 2 centuries, it had been based on the concept of a sovereign republic. We were, after all, the Irish Republican Army, not the United Ireland Army. Until they unilaterally partitioned the country in 1920, the British had always treated Ireland as one political unit. Up to that point, they had no problem with a united Ireland. They had governed a united Ireland for centuries. However, the Brits did have a major problem with the establishment of a sovereign Irish Parliament. Britain wanted to preserve a bridgehead in the strategically placed island on her western flank, and partition permitted that. It allowed them to retain a military garrison in our country. The British considered Ulster Unionists to be what they were initially planted there to be, their civic garrison in Ireland. London rejected the concept of majority all-Ireland opinion and was determined to ensure that the principle of democratic consent applied only to Unionists, who today form a majority in only 2 of Ireland's 32 counties. What amounted to a Unionist veto over Irish independence was calculated to be a permanent dagger aimed at the heart of our national cohesion. So, regardless of what IRA activity I and others were engaged in, the political and historical context of Ireland's fight for complete independence influenced everything we did. Meanwhile, back in Boston, I struck up a good relationship with Pat Nee. I moved into his apartment on East Broadway in Southie, sleeping on a fold-up army cot in his sitting room. When I eventually told Pat that I, too, had served in the Marine Corps, we formed a bond that ex-Marines everywhere will understand. Pat showed me how to purchase military goods by mail order, such as rifle magazines, telescopic sights, and even night vision equipment. Much of the material was sent to the Columbia Yacht Club in Southie, as Pat had a contact there who signed for it. I was buying accessories I believed were needed. We only had 1 magazine for many of our rifles in Ireland. I bought 1,000 synthetic magazines for our Armalites, high quality, rust-free, and self-lubricating. I had never seen a volunteer wear an ammunition pouch on an operation. In the rare case they had a spare magazine, men would sometimes drop it or lose it from their coat pocket while running, so I purchased a couple of 100 rifle magazine chest pouches. I got a bit of stick over this from a Belfast IRA leader. He thought it a waste of money because they weren't necessary in the city. But I knew from experience that operating in a rural environment was a different matter, and that the volunteers on the ground would appreciate them. Furthermore, I felt there was a tendency to think more in terms of killing as opposed to soldiering. You can kill a man with a single blast from a sawn-off shotgun. You don't need accoutrements. However, fighting a sophisticated war against the British Army would necessitate a more studied and robust approach towards weaponry and ammunition supply. I made infrequent trips back and forth to Ireland to brief the IRA on developments. These would have taken place primarily in the last half of 1983 and early 1984. I would see Sharon fleetingly and disappear again. It was emotional torment for us both. During one of these trips home, I had another tense meeting with Martin McGuinness in the Botanic Gardens in Dublin. Martin maintained a rigorously mechanistic view of military equipment, emphasizing quantity as opposed to quality. I told him I wanted to purchase a substantial number of Swedish aim-point sights for our rifles. Many IRA operations took place at night or in conditions of low visibility. Volunteers couldn't aim because they could not see their sights in these conditions. The aim point was battery-operated. It had no magnification, but projected a red dot onto the target, allowing the operator to shoot with both eyes open, day or night. It didn't matter if it was so dark you couldn't see your rifle, you still acquired a distinct point of aim. Furthermore, the aim point was parallax-free, which, without getting bogged down in technical jargon, meant that once correctly zeroed, the target was getting hit if the dot was on it. "So it's a laser?" asked Martin. "No, it's not a laser," I replied. "It uses a light-emitting diode to produce an aiming dot, which is reflected off the front lens back towards the shooter's eye. The projection of the dot on the target is an optical illusion. The enemy can't see it. We could put them on Armalites, AKs, and even the RPG with the proper mount. Any weapon, really." Martin asked me the price. I can't remember what they cost, but it was by no means prohibitive. Besides, the IRA wasn't coughing up the money. I was getting most of it from supporters in America. I emphasized that, in my opinion, aim points would drastically improve our operational effectiveness. Martin seemed lost in thought for a time, but finally shook his head. He told me not to buy them, to concentrate on guns. I could not comprehend his reasoning, or even if he had a reason. I knew there was no point in arguing my case. Martin was used to getting his way. He could be quite forceful when challenged. I then told him I had acquired a Litton M845 third-generation night vision weapon sight and had mounted it on an accurized Armalite rifle with a sound suppressor, more commonly known as silencers. Suppressors are illegal in America unless bought from a dealer with a Class 3 federal firearms license and registered with the government. Whitey knew a guy who made superb ones and didn't ask for paperwork, only money. I explained that the Litton night sight was passive. It emitted no radiation like an active infrared device, so could not be detected by the enemy. The Litton made it possible to view targets and terrain in the darkest conditions. It had a red dot reticle for aiming. I suggested that in South Armagh or East Tyrone, the combination of night vision, accuracy, and sound suppression would pose a severe difficulty for British troops on night patrol. "We could buy 5 Armalites for the price of that one Armalite," said Martin. "I know, but what's going to be more effective? This sniping package or 5 Armalites where we'll probably lose 3 of them before they fire a shot. Just stick to buying guns and forget about silencers. They screw up the weapon." Christ, I thought, I'm hearing this shit about suppressors everywhere. While I instinctively respected anyone in a leadership position, this was beginning to piss me off. I could see there was no point in pursuing this line any further. My instructions were clear: no aim points, no night vision, and no suppressors. I left the man the British claimed was our greatest military thinker feeling depressed and demoralized. Back in Boston, I had regular conversations with Whitey Bulger. When I say conversations, I mean he did most of the talking. I would be out all day, often in the company of Pat Nee, trying to put things together. Mark had gone to New York to manage our operations there. I was tired by evening and ready to conk out on the army cot. Whitey was a nocturnal predator. He would come over to Pat's apartment around 10 or 11 o'clock, usually in the company of Stevie Flemmy, and hold court until 2 in the morning. Flemmy was the son of Italian immigrants. He was a former paratrooper who fought during the Korean War and had been awarded the Silver Star and the Bronze Star for valor. His nickname was the Rifleman. He maintained a respectful silence while Whitey talked. I never got to know him beyond forming a superficial opinion that he was polite, intelligent, and reserved. Years later, When I learned he would pull the teeth out of corpses he and Whitey had murdered, I was reminded of a lesson I should have remembered from my experiences in the IRA. Never, ever judge a book by its cover. Whitey would offer his opinion on how the IRA should operate and suggest ways and means of fighting the Brits. I struggled to keep my eyes open. I knew that if I yawned or nodded off, he would be intensely insulted. That could have repercussions. It's not that he was boring, we just had different sleep cycles. His day infringed on my night. In his book, A Criminal and an Irishman, Pat Nee speaks of Whitey Bulger suggesting that the IRA used time pencils attached to incendiary material to destroy British Airways jets. I remember that conversation. Time pencils are delay devices that use acid to burn through a wire holding back a striker. When the wire eventually snaps, the striker hits a primer that detonates a blasting cap. Whitey suggested they could be planted on the plane by a departing passenger, and millions of dollars worth of aircraft would go up in flames. In fairness, he intended this for use on the ground when the jet was parked. He didn't suggest it be used in flight. I nodded and said, "Great idea, Jim. That's the type of thinking we need." It was a crazy suggestion. Something would inevitably go wrong. A device could malfunction and fail to go off on the ground, but detonate later, in flight, killing hundreds of innocent civilians. There was no way we would contemplate risking that. As time went by, I got to know Whitey better and began to hear stories about him from some of his men. He could be impulsively generous, but just as impulsively deadly. One story I heard was that he needed a man killed, but didn't want any suspicion to rebound on him. So he entered the man's apartment, placed a blowtorch, sleeping pills, and a bottle of whiskey on a coffee table, and told the man to choose his method of murder. Whitey made it clear there was no way out. It was going to be one way or the other. After a few hours of crying and begging, the man eventually downed the pills and whiskey. His death was classed as suicide. The story may be apocryphal, but something about Jim Bulger made me believe he was capable of it. I had to walk on eggshells. Whitey asked me to show him how to make an undercar booby-trap bomb used by the IRA. This was an improvised explosive device that was attached under a target vehicle with a magnet. It contained a mercury tilt switch. The bomb would detonate when the car moved or hit a bump in the road. I had to think quickly. We could not have Whitey Bulger killing people in Boston with technology linked to the IRA. I lied that I had no idea how to make one, that our engineering department manufactured them, and all our volunteers had to do was place them on a target and remove the safety peg. I kicked the can down the road. I told them I would find someone in Ireland who would fly to Boston and show him how to make the booby trap. I knew that would never happen, but it gave me breathing space to work on other things. Whitey suggested he could arrange for IRA men on the run to move to Boston, where he would supply them with false identifications, work, and places to live. I knew what he was getting at. He saw himself with a small army of IRA hitmen indebted to him and under his control. That could never happen either. Jim Bulger was giving us crucial help, but he thought like a criminal, not a patriot. He didn't grasp the political considerations we had to factor in when planning or conducting military operations. Nor did he have the type of personality that would tolerate all that aid going in one direction for long. I knew that if my Boston mission dragged on without something in it for him, I would eventually wear out my welcome. I sometimes had the feeling that Whitey was sizing me up, that he didn't quite know what to make of me. On more than one occasion, it crossed my mind that gun-running activities on his patch could one day cause him difficulties he would need to resolve. Pat Nee was sincere and highly invested in our project, which took him away from work more profitable for Whitey. I wondered what would happen if my mission ever seriously conflicted with Whitey's operation. I suspected I could end up in a lobster pot at the bottom of Boston Harbor. Eventually, the IRA would send someone looking for me. All Whitey had to say was, "Geez, I gave John $200,000 to bring over to you guys. Ain't you seen him?" I never trusted him and could never relax in his company. I was a soldier, but Whitey Bulger was a killer.
I'm Nicola Tallant and you're watching Crime World, a podcast about criminals, drugs and the underworld in Ireland and across the globe. Make sure you subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you can be the first to watch all our latest episodes. You can also listen wherever you get your podcasts.